A man in a worn coat walked into one of the most powerful corporate towers in the country, carrying nothing but a sealed envelope and a phone that wasn't his. He looked like he didn't belong. He looked like a mistake. Security grabbed him before he made it past the lobby, and when they smashed that phone against the marble floor, they didn't know they had just locked every door in the building, frozen $60 million in company assets, and cut off the one man who could have saved them all. If you've ever been underestimated, you're going to want to stay until the very end of this one. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Now let's get into it. The lobby of Sterling Dominion's headquarters smelled like money, not in the obvious way, not cologne and leather and imported coffee, though those were all present. It was something subtler. The air itself seemed filtered and pressurized, the kind of environment engineered to make a certain type of person feel powerful and another type feel small. 40-foot ceilings, a marble floor the color of bleached bone, a reception desk staffed by two young women who had been trained to smile in a way that communicated both warmth and a polished form of dismissal. It was 8:43 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the building hummed with the particular energy of people who believed today was going to be ordinary. Ethan Carter pushed through the revolving door and brought the outside world in with him. He was 37 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who have survived things tend to look older. Not decrepit, just used. His coat was a dark navy wool that had been good quality once, years ago, before it absorbed 2 winters of hard use. His boots were clean but scuffed at the toe. He carried no briefcase, no laptop bag, no coffee cup with a logo on it, just a sealed envelope tucked under his left arm and a phone held loosely in his right hand, a device that, to anyone glancing at it, looked like nothing worth noticing. He moved through the lobby the way he moved through most spaces, quietly, without hurrying, without the slightly performative confidence of men who needed people to notice them walking into rooms. He clocked the exits in the first 3 seconds, noted the 2 security cameras in the upper corners, the single guard at the left side of the desk, the second guard stationed near the elevator bank. He counted the people crossing the lobby floor, 14, most of them moving with purpose, heads down, badges visible. He walked straight toward the reception desk. "I need to reach Amelia Sterling," he said. His voice was level and unhurried, a voice that had learned not to waste energy on volume. "My name is Ethan Carter. I don't have an appointment." The woman behind the desk, her name tag said Priya, looked up at him with a professionally neutral expression that flickered just slightly at the no appointment part. "Do you have a contact name? Someone inside who can verify your visit?" Her father arranged it. The flicker again. George Sterling had founded this company 31 years ago and had not set foot in this building in over 14 months. Everyone inside Sterling Dominion knew that. The statement landed oddly, and Ethan could see Priya processing it, deciding how to handle it gracefully. "If you'd like to leave a message, I'd rather wait," he said. "I understand it's unusual. I'm happy to wait." He stepped to the side of the desk, found a spot near one of the structural columns, and stood there. Not sitting, standing, back to the column, facing the room. His right hand stayed loosely at his side, the phone tucked against his palm, and every 30 seconds or so the screen lit up briefly, showing a call in progress. Not ringing, connected. Someone on the other end listening or waiting, the line held open. He'd been there 11 minutes when Jackson Reed noticed him. Jackson Reed was 44 years old and had spent 2 decades in corporate security after a decade before that in law enforcement. He was good at his job, efficient, observant, and possessed of an instinct for threat assessment that had served him well in every environment he'd worked in. He was also, as he would later admit, a man whose instincts sometimes ran slightly ahead of his judgment. He saw Ethan the way a dog notices something that doesn't belong on familiar ground. Not alarm exactly, but attention. The coat, the boots, the absence of any corporate signifier, the way the man was standing against the column rather than sitting like a normal visitor, watching the lobby with eyes that moved in the practiced, systematic way of someone who was measuring rather than observing. Jackson crossed the lobby floor. "Sir?" His tone was polite, but it carried the particular weight of a man who was not really asking. "Can I help you with something?" Ethan looked at him without moving his head, just his eyes, which was somehow more unsettling than a full look would have been. "I'm waiting to speak with Ms. Sterling. I've already checked in with reception." "And what's the nature of your visit?" "Personal. Arranged by her father." Jackson studied him for a moment. The sealed envelope. The phone with its screen still lit. The fact that this man had not produced a business card, a badge, a letter of introduction. Nothing. "I'm going to need you to verify your identity and state your business more specifically before I can allow you to wait in this lobby." "I understand that," Ethan said, "and I'm not trying to make your job harder, but I need you to know that the phone call I'm currently holding open cannot be interrupted. When I'm able to speak with Ms. Sterling, this call will be transferred to her directly. If the call is cut off before that happens, sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Not fear, something more like resignation. The look of a man watching a bad outcome arrive that he'd already seen coming and couldn't stop. "Please don't touch that device," he said quietly. "I'm asking you seriously." It was the calmness that did it, maybe. The calmness and the fact that this man in a worn coat was looking at Jackson Reed with an expression that suggested he, Ethan Carter, was the one doing Jackson a favor by speaking at all. It got under Jackson's skin in a way he couldn't explain and didn't pause to examine. He reached for the phone. Ethan didn't fight him. He went still the way a man goes still when fighting would only make things worse. A calculated stillness that Jackson, in his agitation, misread as defeat. He grabbed the phone, and Ethan said one more time, very quietly, "Don't." Jackson pulled the phone free and brought it down hard against the marble floor. The screen splintered. The casing cracked along both seams. The phone hit the floor and broke cleanly in two. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the lights changed. Bob. It wasn't a power failure. The lights didn't go out. They shifted, dropping from their usual calibrated brightness to a lower register, a warmer and somehow more ominous tone, as a strip of red emergency lighting activated along the baseboards throughout the lobby. The 2 security doors at the far end of the space sealed with a sound like a vault closing, a deep, pressurized thunk that resonated through the floor. The elevator stopped. All 4 of them, simultaneously, their floor indicators freezing mid-number like a paused clock. The lobby, which had been humming with quiet corporate movement 30 seconds ago, went still. Then someone's phone beeped. Then another. Then a third. And a fourth. Across the building, on floors above them, devices were picking up emergency alerts from the company's internal network. A cascade of notifications that Sterling Dominion's financial operating systems had entered a protected lockdown state, all external transactions suspended, all data transfers blocked. $62 million in pending market activity paused. 14 active contract negotiations frozen. The company's flagship security technology, a system called Sentinel, the crown jewel of everything Sterling Dominion had built over the past 8 years, sealed behind a wall of emergency encryption that would require a specific authentication sequence to undo. An authentication sequence that had been stored on the device now lying in pieces on the lobby floor. Jackson Reed stood in the middle of the marble, looking at what he'd done, and the blood had gone out of his face entirely. Priya at the reception desk had a phone pressed to her ear, and her composure had finally broken. She was speaking in a low, rapid voice, her eyes moving between Jackson and the broken pieces of the device on the floor. "The lockdowns hit the entire building," she said, to whoever was on the other end. "All floors. Security is asking for a status explanation, and we don't have one." Ethan bent down and picked up the larger of the 2 broken pieces. He turned it over in his hand, examined the fractured screen, and set it carefully on the counter beside him. "The call that was active on that phone," he said, his voice exactly as level as it had been before, "was being held open by George Sterling. He was waiting to verify my identity to your CEO directly, in real time, so that the transfer of authentication would be authorized and the system would remain stable." He paused. "The lockdown is an automatic failsafe. It triggered when the verified line went dead." Jackson's jaw worked for a moment. You're saying the founder was on that phone, yes. That's not. Jackson stopped, started again. George Sterling hasn't communicated with anyone in this company in over a year. There's been no official communication, Ethan said. That's different from no communication at all. He picked up the sealed envelope from where it had fallen during the struggle and set it on the reception counter. I'd like to speak with Ms. Sterling now, he said. I think everyone in this building would benefit from that happening as quickly as possible. Amelia Sterling arrived in the lobby 14 minutes later, and she arrived the way she did most things, slightly faster than people expected, and with the look of someone who had already been thinking 3 steps ahead of the current situation for the past 10 minutes. She was 30 years old, which, in the context of running a company her father had built, from nothing sometimes felt like the most irrelevant fact about her, and sometimes felt like the only thing anyone saw. She had her father's eyes, dark, direct, the kind of eyes that made people feel seen in a way they weren't always comfortable with. She wore a dark blazer over a gray shirt, no jewelry except for a single ring on her right hand that she twisted unconsciously when she was processing something difficult. She was twisting it now. She crossed the lobby and stopped in front of Ethan with about 4 feet of space between them, looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then looked at the broken pieces on the counter. That was the authentication device, she said. Yes. And you're Ethan Carter. Yes. She looked at him the way people look at things they're trying to read in low light, with a particular focused patience. My father sent you. He asked me to come. There's a difference, I suppose, but the answer is yes. You've never met me? No. But my father... She stopped, reorganized. How long have you known him? Long enough, Ethan said. We served together briefly a long time ago, before he built any of this. He reached out to me 6 weeks ago because he needed someone he trusted, and he didn't have many of those left. Something crossed her face at that. A flash of something that might have been grief, or might have been something harder than grief. The particular expression of a person who has had to rearrange their understanding of a relationship and hasn't quite finished doing it yet. He didn't trust the people around him, she said. It wasn't quite a question. No. Including me? Ethan considered that for a moment. He trusted you completely, he said. He didn't trust the people around you. That's why he sent someone from outside. Amelia looked at the envelope. Is that for me? It's from him. Yes. She didn't take it yet. She looked back at Ethan with that steady gaze and said, Before I open anything or do anything, I need to understand who you are outside of whatever my father told you to tell me. Because right now I have a building in lockdown, $60 million frozen, and a stranger in my lobby who my head of security assaulted and who apparently had the ability to seal my entire company with a phone call. She paused. So, who are you? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Around them, the lobby had cleared slightly, security personnel moving people back from the main floor, voices carrying through the space in the muted, controlled way of people trying to stay calm in a situation they didn't understand. I'm a single father, he said. I have a 10-year-old daughter named Maya, and I pick her up from school every Tuesday and Thursday. Before that, I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL and another 4 in intelligence-adjacent work I can't fully discuss. And then I got out and I've been doing private security consulting for the past 7 years. Mostly small contracts. Nothing as large as this. He paused again. I'm not impressive looking. I know that. I came here in the only coat I had that was appropriate, and apparently it wasn't appropriate enough. But your father trusted me, and I don't take that lightly. And I need you to at least consider the possibility that he had a reason. Amelia was quiet. Then she reached out and took the envelope. She held it for a moment without opening it, feeling the weight of it. And then she looked up at Jackson Reed, who had not moved from his position 6 feet away, and whose expression had moved through several stages of difficult emotion and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of a man waiting for a verdict. We need a room, she said, and we need to figure out how to restore partial systems before this lockdown damages anything we can't undo. She looked at Ethan. You're coming with me. Yes, he said. And Mr. Carter. She glanced down at the broken pieces of the phone, then back at him. Whatever my father told you that you're still holding back, I'm going to need all of it. Ethan picked up the larger fragment of the broken device and tucked it carefully into his coat pocket. I know, he said. Jackson Reed watched them walk toward the sealed security door and then looked down at the marble floor at his feet, at the smaller fragments of broken casing still scattered there, catching the red emergency light. He'd been doing this job for 20 years. He couldn't remember making a worse call in his life. He crouched down and began picking up the pieces. The conference room on the 14th floor was called the Meridian Room, and it had the particular quality of spaces designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a long table of dark walnut that reflected the overhead lighting, chairs upholstered in a gray so precise it felt chosen by committee. Under normal circumstances, it projected authority and calm. Right now, with the emergency lighting still bleeding red through the corridor outside, and 3 different people's phones buzzing with alerts from the lockdown floors below, it felt like the inside of a pressure cooker with the heat still on. Amelia set the sealed envelope on the table in front of her, but didn't open it. Not yet. She sat with her hands flat on the walnut surface and looked across at Ethan, who had taken a chair 2 seats down from her rather than directly across. A small thing, but it meant he wasn't positioning himself as an adversary, and she noticed that. Jackson Reed stood near the door. He hadn't been invited to sit and hadn't asked. Start from the beginning, Amelia said. Not the version you rehearsed, the actual beginning. Ethan looked at her for a moment. 6 weeks ago, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. When I did, the voice on the other end said, "It's George Sterling. I need to ask you something, and I need you to say no if you're not sure, because I can't afford a mistake right now." Gishguams, he paused. I hadn't spoken to your father in 11 years. How did you know him? We overlapped briefly in a joint operation, late 2009, early 2010. He wasn't military, but he was embedded with a contractor group we worked alongside for about 4 months. Smart man, careful, the kind of person who watches more than he talks. Ethan's eyes moved briefly to the window, then back. He remembered things about people. I think that's why he called me. He'd remembered enough about me to decide I was worth trusting. What did he ask you? He told me he'd been watching something develop inside Sterling Dominion for about 8 months. Movement in the financial architecture. Not obvious theft, nothing that would trip a standard audit, but patterns he recognized from his early years building the company. The kind of patterns that show up when someone is repositioning assets in preparation for a transfer of control. Ethan kept his voice even, factual, the way he delivered information when he needed someone to hear it without their defenses going up. He said he'd tried to verify it himself, but every time he got close to something concrete, the trail moved. Records were being cleaned after the fact. He couldn't tell how far the access went, whether it was one person or several, and that meant he couldn't trust anyone inside the company to help him investigate without risking tipping off the people responsible. Amelia's hands were still flat on the table, but her fingers had pressed slightly harder into the wood. Why didn't he come to me directly? He said he tried, 3 months ago. He told you he was concerned about some financial irregularities and asked you to look into them quietly. She was quiet for a moment. I looked into it. The CFO's office did a review. They found nothing flagged. He knows that, Ethan said. That's what scared him. It landed the way he'd known it would. Not like a blow exactly, more like a floor shifting slightly underfoot. Amelia sat back in her chair and Ethan watched her process it. Watched her move through the quick, clean stages of a sharp mind confronting a conclusion it didn't want to reach. The review that found nothing. The CFO's office. The absence of a flag where there should have been one. He thinks the review was compromised, she said. He thinks whoever is doing this has access deep enough to clean up after themselves before a standard internal review would catch anything. Which means either they have significant technical access to the company's systems, significant influence over the people running those systems, or both. And Sentinel. She said the word carefully, like it had weight. He mentioned Sentinel specifically? That's the target, Ethan said. Not the company's cash, not the real estate portfolio or the market positions. Sentinel itself, the technology, the licensing architecture, the proprietary security framework underneath it. Your father said that in the right hands, Sentinel would be worth somewhere between $400 and $600 million on the private market. In the wrong hands, he stopped. He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. Jackson moved slightly near the door, not dramatically, a small shift of weight, the kind of involuntary movement a person makes when they're hearing something that's recalibrating what they thought they knew. Amelia glanced at him briefly and then back at Ethan. You said the evidence pointed toward someone specific, she said. My father gave you a name. He gave me documentation, Ethan said. The envelope has some of it. The rest was on the device. He touched his coat pocket briefly. The fragment was still there. What he could recover without arousing suspicion, he compiled over about 4 weeks. Financial records, internal communication timestamps, access logs from the Sentinel development server. The documentation in that envelope connects a pattern of system access and asset movement to a single user profile. Amelia looked at the envelope. She reached for it slowly, broke the seal with her thumb, and pulled out the contents. Several folded pages printed in small type, and a single index card on which her father had written something in his particular cramped handwriting. She read the index card first. Whatever it said, her expression didn't change outwardly, but the ring on her right hand started moving again. She set the card face down on the table. She unfolded the printed pages and read them in silence. Ethan waited. Jackson waited. Outside the windows, the city moved through its ordinary morning with no awareness of any of this. After 4 minutes, Amelia set the pages down. She looked at them for another moment without speaking. Then she said, Ryan. It wasn't a question. Her voice had a quality to it. Not disbelief, which would have been easier. Something more specific than disbelief. The particular sound of a person confirming something they had been, on some level, afraid of without letting themselves name the fear. Ryan Walker was 41 years old and had been with Sterling Dominion for 9 years. He had come in as a senior financial strategist and moved upward with the kind of steady, unremarkable consistency that organizations trust. Never flashy, never the loudest voice in the room, reliably present and reliably effective. When Amelia had taken over as CEO 18 months ago, Ryan had been her steadiest advocate on the executive team. He'd managed the transition with a competence that had felt, at the time, like loyalty. He was the first person to tell me I was ready to run this company, she said. Her voice was flat. After my father stepped back, Ryan was the one who said, in front of the full executive team, that he believed in me. Ethan didn't say anything. How long? She asked. Your father believes the planning started approximately 2 years ago, before you were named CEO. He thinks Ryan identified the transition as an opportunity and began positioning himself during the period when the succession was still being determined. Amelia looked at the ceiling briefly, one of those involuntary gestures people make when they're trying to keep something behind their eyes from getting out. Then she looked back down. The Sentinel authentication system, she said. Walk me through why it matters. In plain terms. Sentinel's core value isn't just the technology itself, Ethan said. It's the proprietary authentication architecture. The layered verification system that controls who can access, modify, or transfer the platform. Your father built that architecture with a master authentication key split into 3 parts. One part is held by the company. One part is held by the CEO, embedded in the executive security protocol. The third part was held by him, offline, in a physical format he kept outside the building. He paused. The device I brought today was carrying a digitally reconstructed version of that third part, transmitted over a verified line to be transferred directly to you as the current CEO. The intent was to consolidate all 3 parts under your authority, closing a gap in the system that Ryan has apparently identified and been planning to exploit. Jackson spoke for the first time since they'd entered the room. What gap? Ethan looked at him. There was no edge in it, just the even, direct attention of a man who answered questions honestly, regardless of who was asking. The gap between what the system technically allows and what the current authorization structure actually verifies. Sentinel's transfer protocol was written to require 2 of 3 authentication parts, not all 3. Your father wrote it that way as an emergency redundancy measure. in case one part was lost or compromised. Ryan apparently discovered that if he could forge one part and hold another, he could technically authorize a transfer of the platform without the CEO's involvement. He'd need to forge the CEO's part, Amelia said, or find a way to generate what would appear to be a valid CEO-level digital signature approving the transfer. The room was quiet for a moment. A fake signature, Amelia said. Specifically, a fake authorization signature on a board-level transfer document, something that would appear in the company's legal record to show that you personally approved the transfer of Sentinel's licensing rights to a third-party entity. Ethan's voice stayed level. If that document existed and the authentication appeared valid, the board would have grounds to execute the transfer regardless of what you said afterward. You'd be fighting a legal record that showed your own approval. Amelia's jaw tightened slightly. And with the lockdown, he can't execute it right now. The lockdown froze all transfer protocols. But the lockdown won't hold indefinitely. The system was designed to unlock automatically after 72 hours if no authentication restore is completed. Ryan knows that. If he's as far along as your father believes, he may already have the forged document prepared, which means he's working with a 72-hour window. Jackson came away from the door. He moved to the table and stood at the far end of it, and his face had the expression of a man who was doing the uncomfortable work of adding things up in real time and not liking the sum. The internal security audit 3 months ago, he said, the one that cleared the financial review. Ethan looked at him. It was coordinated through my department, Jackson said. Standard protocol. Any internal investigation of that scope goes through security. I assigned Connor Blake to oversee the technical review. He paused. Connor Blake is Ryan Walker's direct contact in the security division, has been for 2 years. The sentence sat there in the room like something dropped on a glass table. The kind of statement that, once made, changed the shape of everything around it. Amelia looked at Jackson steadily. She didn't say anything immediately, which was worse in its own way than if she'd responded quickly. You didn't know that, Ethan said to Jackson. It wasn't generous, it was just factual. I should have known it, Jackson said. That's my department. Those are my people. If Blake was feeding a compromised review to protect Walker, that happened on my watch, inside my unit. His voice was controlled, but there was something rough underneath it. I destroyed the one device that could have fixed this because I looked at you and decided you were the problem. I didn't ask enough questions. He stopped. I acted. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You acted on what you had. What you had was incomplete. That's a generous read. It's an accurate one. And it doesn't help anything right now, so let's set it aside. Jackson looked at him. The look of a man who wasn't sure if he was being handled or genuinely spoken to. Then something in his face settled slightly, and he pulled out a chair and sat down at the far end of the table. Amelia spread the printed pages across the walnut surface, and they spent the next 40 minutes going through them. The access logs, the financial movement records, the communication timestamps. Ethan walked them through what her father had compiled and what it indicated, and what the gaps in the documentation still needed to confirm. He wasn't dramatic about it. He laid it out the way someone lays out a map. Here's what we know, here's what we can infer, here's what we still need. The access logs showed that over 14 months, someone using a rotating series of authenticated user profiles had made incremental, carefully timed adjustments to Sterling Dominion's internal asset classification system, reclassifying components of the Sentinel platform's licensing structure in ways that would be nearly invisible in isolation, but that collectively amounted to a restructuring of how the platform's ownership rights were documented. Each individual adjustment had passed automated review. No single change was large enough to trigger a manual audit flag. But taken together, reading the sequence of them as your father had, a picture emerged with uncomfortable clarity. He's been building this for months, Amelia said, almost to herself. He's been careful, Ethan said. Patient. That's the thing about this kind of operation. It only works if you never move too fast. Each step has to be small enough that nobody stops to look at the full staircase. Until now. Until your father started looking at the full staircase. She looked at the pages again. Then she looked at Ethan with something new in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. The particular look of a person who has updated their assessment. He trusted you with all of this, gave you the documentation, sent you in with the authentication device. He built an entire contingency around you getting access to me. She paused. He could have hired a corporate attorney, a forensic accountant, someone with institutional credibility. Yes, Ethan said. Why you? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a bird moved across the glass in a gray streak and was gone. Because those people would have needed to trust the system to work in, he said. Attorneys file motions. Accountants generate reports. Everything they do leaves a record inside institutional channels. Channels your father wasn't sure were clean. He needed someone who could operate outside the system, who could carry physical documentation without a digital trail, who could make a direct human contact, you, face to face, without any of it passing through a network that might be monitored. He shrugged slightly, which on him looked less like casualness and more like the gesture of a man who didn't attach more meaning to his own usefulness than was accurate. I'm not impressive. I know what I look like. But that was part of the point. Nobody watches the unremarkable man in the worn coat. Amelia was quiet for a long moment. Ryan is going to move when the board convenes today, she said. He called the emergency session yesterday. Standard protocol, given the financial irregularities that my office flagged last week. A pause, which I now have to reconsider, since apparently the flagging itself may have been engineered to create the conditions for an emergency board meeting. What time is the session? 2:00. Ethan looked at his watch. It was 9:51. 4 hours. We need proof that can stand in front of that board, Amelia said. Not documentation my father compiled privately and had delivered by someone with no official standing. Verifiable chain of custody evidence that I can present as CEO of this company and have it hold. The Sentinel system itself has the records, Ethan said. The access logs I described, those exist inside Sentinel's security architecture. They can't be cleaned without leaving a trace of the cleaning itself. If we can access the offline vault where the most sensitive system logs are stored. The White Room, Amelia said. Jackson looked up. How do you know about the White Room? Your father mentioned it, Ethan said. He said it was the one place in the building where system records were stored in a format that couldn't be remotely altered. Physical server architecture, air-gapped from the main network. It's on sublevel 3, Jackson said slowly. Access requires 2-key authentication, Security Director and CEO. He paused. I have one of those keys. Blake controls the Security Director's override in my absence, but I'm here. His voice had changed. Some of the flatness had been replaced by something more purposeful. I can get us in. We'll need Grace Parker, Amelia said, company attorney. If we're going to present evidence to the board, I want legal counsel in the room when we access and copy those records. I'm not giving Ryan anything to contest on procedural grounds. I'll call her, Jackson said, already moving. Jackson. He stopped and looked back at her. Amelia's expression was direct, not unkind, but unsparing. We don't communicate through normal channels right now. We don't know which internal lines are clean. Jackson nodded. I'll go to her office directly. He left. The door closed behind him and his footsteps faded into the corridor, and the Meridian room was quiet for a moment. Just Amelia and Ethan and the pages spread across the walnut table and the red-tinged emergency light still bleeding in from under the door. Amelia looked at the face-down index card. She picked it up and held it for a moment. Ethan didn't ask what it said, and she didn't offer, and then she set it back down and said, He's been in contact with you for 6 weeks. Yes. Is he all right? It was the first time her voice had changed. Not much, but enough. The CEO question and the daughter question were different questions, and she'd just asked the second one. When I last spoke with him, yes, Ethan said carefully. He's been careful about his location. He believed that once he started actively investigating, he became a liability to whoever was running this. That if they discovered he was looking, they'd take steps to neutralize him. He paused. Neutralize meaning discredit, remove access, contain his ability to communicate. Not, I don't believe he's in physical danger. You don't believe. I can't give you certainty I don't have. I'm sorry. She looked at him steadily. Then she nodded once, a small, contained nod that was less about accepting reassurance and more about filing the uncertainty in the correct place and moving forward anyway. We have 4 hours, she said. Let's use them. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the larger fragment of the broken phone. The casing was cracked, and the screen was gone. But beneath the fractured casing, embedded in the device's physical architecture, there was a component that he'd built specifically to survive this scenario. A small encrypted module, separate from the phone's operating system, that stored a partial recovery of the authentication data, and more importantly, a copy of a final transmission her father had been preparing to send when the line went dead. He set the fragment on the table between them. There's still something recoverable from this, he said. I need the right equipment to extract it. Does this building have a hardware lab? Amelia looked at the fragment, then at him. 16th floor, she said. I'll take you there myself. She stood and picked up the pages and folded them carefully back into the envelope. She picked up the index card last, held it for a moment, and then slipped it into the inside pocket of her blazer, close. Whatever her father had written on it, she wasn't ready to set it down yet. Ethan understood that without needing it, explained. He'd been a parent long enough to know that some things you hold on to, even when holding on makes the work harder. He picked up the fragment and followed her out of the room. The hardware lab on the 16th floor was not the kind of space that appeared in Sterling Dominion's press materials. The company's public-facing image was all clean lines and curated glass and the aesthetic of a technology firm that wanted to be taken seriously as an institution. The lab was different, functional in the way that working spaces get functional over time, which is to say it had accumulated the honest clutter of real use, cables coiled on secondary workbenches, a whiteboard covered in half-erased diagrams that someone had run out of time to finish, the faint smell of solder and electronics that no amount of corporate ventilation fully eliminated. 3 workstations sat along the main wall, each running a different operating environment. A locked cabinet on the far side held hardware components behind a mesh door. Amelia had a key card for the cabinet. She opened it without ceremony and stepped back to let Ethan assess what was available. He spent about 40 seconds moving through the contents with the particular efficiency of someone who knows what they're looking for and is used to making do with what's in front of them rather than waiting for ideal conditions. He pulled a micro-extraction kit from the second shelf, a compact forensic hardware set, the kind that corporate security labs kept for device analysis, and carried it to the nearest workstation. This will take time, Agency, he said. The module is intact, but extraction without the operating system means I'm pulling directly from the physical component. I'll need to work carefully or I'll corrupt what's left. How long? He considered. 40 minutes, maybe 50. Amelia looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:18. That gives us about 3 hours before the board session. It should be enough, if the data is what your father told me it was. She pulled a chair from one of the other workstations and sat 2 feet to his left, where she could watch what he was doing without being in the way. She was not the kind of person who waited in a separate room. Ethan registered that without comment and started working. The extraction process was careful and slow in the way that careful, slow work often looks from the outside, like nothing is happening until it is. Ethan disassembled the broken phone's casing with a precision that had nothing performative about it, the way surgeons work in a way that looks almost boring until you understand what's at stake. He separated the encrypted module from the board, connected it to the extraction kit, and began the data recovery sequence through the forensic interface. They were quiet for a while. Not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of 2 people occupying the same space around a shared problem. After about 10 minutes, Amelia said, "Does your daughter know what you do?" Ethan didn't look up from the workstation. "She knows I do security consulting. She's 10. She thinks it means I look at cameras and write reports." "Does she know about the Navy?" "She knows I was in the military. She's seen some photos." A pause. "She doesn't ask much about it. Kids that age are more interested in what you can do for them right now than what you used to be, which is probably healthy." Amelia almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "She lives with you full-time?" "Yeah, her mother and I separated when Maya was 3. It wasn't dramatic. We just stopped working as a unit. She moved to Portland, we arranged custody, and then about 18 months later, she got sick. Cancer. By the time we knew how serious it was, there wasn't much time to restructure anything. Maya's been with me since she was 5. He said it the way people say things they've had a long time to practice saying, not without feeling, but without the raw edge that meant it still caught them off guard. The facts of a life, worn smooth by repetition. Amelia didn't offer condolences. She seemed to understand he wasn't telling her for sympathy. So you've been raising her alone for 5 years while running a security consulting practice. More or less. And my father called you 6 weeks ago and asked you to walk into a corporate crisis with no official standing and no backup. He asked me if I was willing. I said I'd think about it. What made you say yes? Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching the extraction interface cycle through a recovery sequence. He told me what was on the line if Sentinel ended up in the wrong hands, the technology itself, what it's capable of. He wasn't alarmist about it, but he was honest. And he was scared. He glanced sideways at her briefly. Your father doesn't scare easily. I remembered that from a long time ago. When I heard it in his voice, I believed him. Amelia absorbed that. She turned the ring on her right hand once, twice. What is Sentinel actually capable of? Beyond the corporate value, the technical capabilities. He never fully explained it to me in those terms. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen. It's a multi-layered behavioral authentication and threat detection framework. The public version, what your company licenses to financial institutions and government contractors, is genuinely impressive. Pattern recognition, anomaly detection, real-time access monitoring. But your father told me the core architecture, the part that hasn't been publicly licensed, has capabilities significantly beyond what's in the commercial product, such as predictive intrusion modeling, the ability to not just detect unauthorized access, but to map likely attack vectors before they're executed, based on behavioral pattern analysis across a network. In a defensive context, that's extraordinarily valuable, Beck. It essentially lets a security system anticipate where it's going to be hit before the hit comes. He paused. In an offensive context, or in the hands of someone who wanted to sell it to the wrong buyer, it would be a tool for identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in any network it was pointed at. Financial systems, infrastructure, communications architecture. Amelia was quiet for a moment. And Ryan knows this. He spent 9 years inside this company. He knows exactly what he's trying to take. The extraction interface made a soft sound, so a completed sequence, and Ethan leaned forward slightly. He worked through 3 more steps with the forensic kit, and then the screen changed, showing a recovered data structure that organized itself in front of them like a filing cabinet being unpacked in fast forward. There, he said. The recovered data was partial but coherent, a compressed set of files that George Sterling had been assembling as a final transmission. Access logs with user identification data, a documented sequence of asset reclassifications tied to specific timestamps and system credentials, and at the end of the file structure, a single video file, 43 seconds long, recorded on what appeared to be a simple handheld device in a room Ethan didn't recognize. He looked at Amelia. She nodded. He opened the file. George Sterling appeared on the screen. He was sitting in a plain room, bare wall behind him, a single lamp to his left creating the slightly imperfect lighting of someone who'd set up a recording situation quickly without much equipment. He looked older than the photographs on Sterling Dominion's website, older than the company portraits on the lobby wall downstairs. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had decided the time for carrying it quietly had passed. Amelia, he said. His voice was slightly roughened but steady. If you're seeing this, then Ethan got through and the situation has escalated enough that the recorded message matters, which means I need to stop being careful and just say it plainly. Amelia had gone very still. Ryan Walker has been systematically restructuring Sentinel's ownership documentation for 14 months. I have the records. They're in this package. The goal is a forced transfer. He intends to present the board with a document bearing what will appear to be your authorized signature approving a licensing transfer of Sentinel's core architecture to a holding company called Veristone Capital. Veristone is his. It's been registered under a secondary name, and it won't trace back to him easily, but it traces back to him. The documentation for that is in here too." He paused, rubbed his jaw with one hand, a gesture Amelia recognized, had seen 100 times in her childhood without knowing the name for it. "I should have told you more of this earlier. I was trying to protect you from the uncertainty while I built a solid enough case to act on, and that was the wrong call. I knew something was wrong, and I kept it contained, and I gave him more time than I should have." He looked directly into the camera. "That's on me. Whatever else happens, that part is on me." Another pause, longer. "There's one more thing, and I need you to hear this carefully." He leaned slightly forward. "I'm not where you think I am. I haven't been where anyone thinks I am for 3 months. I went off grid when I realized the investigation had been burned and that whoever was inside the company monitoring it would eventually realize the information they suppressed hadn't disappeared, just moved. I'm safe. I'm being careful. But I needed you to know I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not gone. I'm still here. I just needed everyone, including Ryan, to be uncertain about that." The recording ended. The room was quiet except for the ambient hum of the workstation. Amelia sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the dark screen where her father's face had been. She didn't move for a long moment. Then she breathed out slowly, a long, controlled breath that was doing a lot of work. "He's alive," she said, not surprised, not relieved exactly, something more complex than either. "Yes," Ethan said. "He's been hiding for 3 months, and he sent me a message through a former Navy SEAL on a phone that got smashed in my lobby." She stopped. That is the most my father thing I've ever heard in my life." Ethan looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression that might, under different circumstances, have been the precursor to a smile. "He mentioned you'd probably say something like that." "Of course he did." She stood up, and the complicated stillness of the past 2 minutes shifted into something with more motion in it. She was moving now, thinking on her feet, which was clearly where she did her best thinking. "We have the recording, the access logs, the Veristone documentation. That's enough for the board?" "With Grace Parker's review, it should be. The chain of evidence isn't perfect. Nothing that came through an unconventional channel ever is. But the documentation itself is internally consistent, and it corroborates what Sentinel's own system logs will show once we access the White Room." He removed the extracted module from the forensic kit and connected a secure drive to copy the files. "The combination of your father's compiled evidence and the native system records from Sentinel's own architecture should be more than the board can dismiss. Ryan will contest everything. He'll try, but he's contesting facts, not just documents. The Sentinel access logs live in the system itself. They exist independent of anything your father compiled. The White Room records will show the same pattern from a completely separate source." He ejected the secure drive and held it out to her. 2 independent lines of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. She took the drive, held it for a moment. "My father trusts you," she said. "With something this important, something he built his whole life. He trusted you to carry it." She looked at him directly. "I want to understand why a man who checks everything twice sent a single person with a single device through a front door with no backup plan." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "There was a backup plan," he said. "It was less elegant." "What was it?" "If I didn't get through to you by 10 a.m., a set of encrypted files was scheduled to transmit to 3 separate legal addresses, 2 outside counsel firms your father pre-selected, and a financial crimes division contact at a federal agency. The legal route. Slower, less certain, more collateral exposure for the company, but a fallback." He paused. "He wanted to give you the chance to handle it internally first. Keep control inside the company." Amelia absorbed that. "He still thinks like a founder." He never stopped. She pocketed the drive and looked at the clock. 10:57. Just over 3 hours. They found Grace Parker in her office on the 12th floor, where Jackson had reached her 17 minutes earlier, and where she had spent those 17 minutes pulling every relevant piece of Sterling Dominion's internal governance documentation she could access from the partially locked down system. Grace was 53 years old, had been the company's general counsel for 6 years, and had the particular quality of attorneys who have seen enough bad situations that new ones don't produce panic so much as a kind of focused, organized anger. She looked at Ethan the way she looked at most things, with professional assessment rather than judgment. And when Amelia laid out what they had, Grace sat very still and listened with the listening style of someone who is simultaneously taking in information and constructing its legal architecture in real time. When Amelia finished, Grace said, "The video is admissible as a corroborating statement from the company founder. It's not sworn testimony, and Ryan's attorneys will challenge its provenance, but in a board context, not a courtroom, it carries significant weight." She turned to the secure drive on the desk in front of her. The Verestone documentation, if it traces back to Walker as cleanly as the file suggests, is the most critical piece. That's the element that converts this from an internal dispute about financial mismanagement into something with criminal exposure. "Which is why we need the White Room records to corroborate it," Jackson said. He was standing near the window, and he'd been quiet since they'd come in. A different kind of quiet than his lobby silence. That had been the quiet of authority. This was the quiet of a man who was working. The White Room records, plus the Verestone documentation, plus the video, plus the access logs from Sentinel's development server, Grace said. That's 4 independent lines of evidence. Ryan can contest 1. Contesting all 4 in the next... She looked at the clock. In the next 2 hours and 40 minutes? In front of a board that's going to be looking at the same materials simultaneously? He'll try to buy time, Amelia said. Move to postpone procedural challenges. Then we move faster than he expects, Grace said. We present before he has a chance to set the frame. She looked at Jackson. The White Room. How long to access? 20 minutes to get down there, run the 2-key authentication, and pull the relevant log files. Maybe 30. Then we need to go now. Grace was already standing, pulling her jacket from the back of her chair. While Ryan is upstairs preparing his presentation for a board meeting, he thinks he controls. Sublevel 3 was below the building's operational floors, below the parking structure, below the mechanical rooms, in a corridor that existed in the architectural plans but didn't appear in any standard facilities guide. The walls were raw concrete and the lighting was fluorescent and utilitarian, and the door to the White Room was a heavy steel panel set flush with the wall, no external handle, opened only by the dual key system mounted to its left. Jackson used his key first. The panel accepted it and shifted to a waiting state, a single amber light holding. Amelia used hers. The light turned green and the door released with a sound like a breath being let out, a slight pressure equalization as the seal broke. The room beyond was cooler than the corridor. Server architecture maintained at a lower temperature, and it was smaller than the name suggested. 4 server units in a 2x2 configuration, each running its own isolated system, air-gapped from Sterling Dominion's main network by physical architecture rather than software. What happened on these servers stayed on these servers unless someone physically removed the data. Ethan assessed the room in his automatic way. Exits, lines of sight, physical vulnerabilities, and then moved to the nearest server terminal with Jackson while Grace stood at the door with the evidence drive and Amelia watched the corridor. System logs for Sentinel access, Jackson said, moving through the terminal's interface. He knew these systems. This was still his domain, regardless of everything else. I need the 14-month window. Start at month 15, Ethan said. Give yourself a clean baseline to compare against. Jackson adjusted the parameters and ran the query. The system was offline from the main network, but it was not slow. It processed the request in seconds and returned a log file that populated the terminal screen in dense rows of timestamp data. Even at a glance, even reading system logs rather than prose, the pattern was visible. Ethan pointed to it without touching the screen. There, same user credential cluster as the records in your father's documentation. Look at the timings, so always between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. on weekdays. Never weekends. Never holidays. Jackson leaned in. Someone who knew the monitoring schedule. Someone who knew exactly when the automated oversight systems ran their daily checks and who had enough access to know the gap between check cycles. Ethan straightened. Whoever this was, they understood the system from the inside. Connor Blake, Jackson said. The name came out of him flatly, without heat, which was somehow worse than anger. He managed our monitoring schedule. He knew every gap, working with Walker's authorization and Walker's access credentials. Jackson didn't say anything for a moment. He copied the log files to the evidence drive, ran a verification hash to confirm the copy was clean, and ejected the drive. He held it for a moment before handing it to Grace. "That's everything from in here?" Grace asked. "Everything that's relevant, yes." He looked at her. "It's enough." She took the drive and added it to the sealed evidence set she'd been building, a physical packet of documented materials that could be presented to the board as a coherent, sequenced package. She was methodical about it in a way that was almost soothing to watch in a moment that didn't have much else that was soothing about it. They were in the White Room for 26 minutes total. When they came back out and the door resealed behind them, Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment and looked at his watch. 12:41. 1 hour and 19 minutes before the board session. He was running calculations, not numbers, the other kind. Variables. The things that could go wrong between now and a conference room on the executive floor where Ryan Walker was almost certainly already positioned. He did this the way he'd been trained to do it, not with anxiety, but with methodical inventory. What he could control, what he couldn't, what the most likely points of failure were, and what existed on the other side of each failure. The most significant variable was the one they hadn't been able to close yet. Ryan had been building this for 14 months. A man who had spent 14 months on a plan did not abandon it because circumstances shifted. He adapted. He had contingencies. And the thing about a man with contingencies was that he always had one you hadn't anticipated. "There's something we haven't talked about," Ethan said. The four of them were moving back toward the elevator, Grace and Jackson slightly ahead. Amelia fell into step beside him at his quieter pace. Ryan's primary plan required the forged signature document to be presented to the board as evidence of your authorization, he said. The lockdown complicated that. It froze the transfer protocols, which means even with the forged document, he can't execute a technical transfer right now. But he doesn't need to execute the transfer today. He needs the board to vote to remove you as CEO on the grounds that you're a liability to the company. Once you're removed, the transfer can happen under new executive authority. His authority, or whoever he installs. Amelia was quiet, walking, listening. So his play today isn't the transfer, Ethan continued. His play is removal. He's going to present whatever he has to that board and make the case that you are the source of Sterling Dominion's current instability. The lockdown, the frozen assets, the lack of communication from the founder. He's going to frame all of it as consequences of your leadership failures. And the forged authorization document? He may not even need to use it today. If he gets the vote, the document becomes a tool for the next step, not this one. Ethan paused. Which means our evidence about Sentinel and Veristone is critical, but it has to be presented in a way that addresses the removal motion directly. Not just proves Ryan committed fraud, but proves he engineered the conditions he's using to justify your removal. Grace had slowed slightly, listening from ahead. That's a more complex evidentiary argument, she said. Proving fraud is one thing. Proving the crisis was manufactured to enable a specific corporate governance maneuver is exactly what the Sentinel access logs and the lockdown sequence together demonstrate, Ethan said. The lockdown happened because the authentication device was destroyed. The authentication device was brought here because of the threat Ryan created. Trace it back and you get a chain that leads directly from his actions to the conditions he's now using as justification. He looked at Grace. You can build that argument. I can build it, she said. I need 45 minutes to structure it properly. You have about 65, he said. Use 45. Leave 20 for contingencies. She nodded once, briskly, and her pace increased toward the elevator. Jackson kept pace with her, and Ethan and Amelia were a few steps behind. There's still one thing that bothers me, Amelia said quietly. Only one? My father is out there, hiding. And Ryan doesn't know that we know he's alive. She paused. Which means Ryan's calculation still includes the possibility of using my father's absence against me, suggesting he's incapacitated, or worse. It's part of the instability narrative. Yes. If my father walked into that board meeting, it would change everything, Ethan said. But I don't know where he is.
and we don't have the means to reach him right now. You said there's no way to contact him? He went dark specifically so he couldn't be reached through channels that might be monitored. The call today was supposed to be the moment of reconnection, the verified line. When that closed, he stopped. He's operating on a contingency timeline. If he doesn't hear from me by a specific point, he'll know the transfer didn't work, and he'll make a decision about what to do next. But I can't reach him. I can only wait to see if he reaches us. Amelia absorbed that. She thought about the index card in her blazer pocket, the cramped handwriting, the words she hadn't shared with anyone in that room. He wrote something to me, she said. In the card. Ethan didn't ask what. He wrote, "Trust the people who show up when it costs them something to be there. Everything else is just manners." She paused. "I've been thinking about it since this morning." The elevator arrived, the four of them stepped in, and the doors closed, and the car began to rise. Ethan stood in the corner with the familiar stillness that he carried like a second skin. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who has learned that the most useful thing he can do in a moving situation is be very, very steady. Whatever was waiting for them on the floors above, Ryan Walker with his prepared presentation, a board of 12 people who were about to be given two very different versions of the same story, a company worth hundreds of millions balanced on the outcome of the next 90 minutes, he had already done the accounting. He couldn't control most of it. He could control where he stood and what he did when the moment came. That had always been enough before. He had to trust it was enough now. Jackson stood across the elevator from him, and at some point during the ride, his eyes met Ethan's briefly. Not a long look, just a moment. The look of two people who understand, without discussing it, that they are past the point of preparation and into the part that cannot be prepared for. The elevator reached the executive floor and the doors opened onto a corridor that smelled like the rest of the building. Filtered air, money, the hum of power. And somewhere ahead of them, Ryan Walker was in a room telling 12 people a story that he had been rehearsing for over a year. They had 63 minutes to tell a better one. Grace Parker needed a room and 45 minutes, and Jackson gave her both. A small conference space 2 floors below the executive level, close enough to move quickly when the time came, far enough that Ryan Walker's people wouldn't stumble onto her by accident.
He posted himself outside the door without being asked, which Amelia noticed and which cost him nothing to do and meant more than he understood. Ethan and Amelia were left in the narrow corridor outside, and for a few minutes neither of them said much. Amelia stood with her back against the wall and her eyes on the middle distance, the particular look of someone running through scenarios at a speed that didn't leave room for conversation. Ethan stood beside her and did what he was good at, which was occupy space quietly without making demands on it. After a while, she said, "Tell me what Ryan does when he realizes we have the evidence." "He's going to know before we present it," Ethan said. "He'll have someone watching, the elevator banks, the corridors near the boardroom. When he sees the 4 of us moving together, he'll understand that whatever he thought the morning looked like, it doesn't look like that anymore. So he'll adapt. He'll try to accelerate, move the board session earlier if he can, or present before we can formally interrupt. He'll want the vote in process before we can introduce counter-evidence, because a vote in process is harder to stop than one that hasn't started." Amelia looked at him. "Can he do that? Move the session time?" He called the emergency session. Under Sterling Dominion's governance structure, who has the authority to adjust the timing? She thought about it. The chair of the board can adjust timing at request of the convening party, with notice to all members. Ryan called the session so he could theoretically request an earlier start if he had a reason. She paused. But board members have to be given adequate notice of any time change. Minimum 30 minutes under the company bylaws. And if he sent that notice while we were in the White Room? Her jaw tightened slightly. Then the session could start as early as 1:30 instead of 2. Ethan checked his watch. 1:04. 26 minutes, he said. Amelia pushed off the wall immediately and opened Grace's door without knocking. "I need you to move faster," she said. Grace looked up from the documents spread across the table in front of her. She had the focused, slightly irritated expression of someone interrupted mid-sentence in their own head. "I heard," she said. "I need 12 more minutes." "You have 10. Grace looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back to the documents.
Then stop talking to me. Amelia closed the door. Ethan's phone, his personal phone, not the destroyed device, buzzed in his pocket. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. The kind of unknown that was specifically constructed to be unknown rather than just unidentified. He answered it. "You're at the building," the voice said. Ethan turned slightly away from Amelia, not from secrecy but from instinct. The adjustment of a man who processes certain kinds of information better with a few inches of private space. "Yes," he said. "The device didn't make it. The line closed." "I know. I've been monitoring through a secondary channel." A pause. "How far along are you?" "We have the evidence. All 4 lines. Grace Parker is structuring the board presentation right now. We need about—" He glanced at Amelia, who was watching him with very still eyes. "We need about 20 minutes, and then we need to get into that boardroom." Walker moved the session. "We figured. 1:30? 1:25. He sent the notice at 12:52. Another pause. "There's something else. He has Connor Blake positioned in the executive corridor with 2 contract security personnel who are not Sterling Dominion employees. I've been watching the building's external camera feeds from outside. Blake and his people arrived on the executive floor 18 minutes ago." Ethan processed that. He's planning to physically block access to the boardroom, or remove someone from the building before the session starts. You specifically. You have no official standing here and Blake has security authority. Ryan only needs 10 minutes of delay, enough to start the session and get a preliminary motion on the floor. Ethan looked at his watch again. 1:07, 18 minutes. "Where are you?" he said. "A beat. Closer than I've been in a while." Ethan closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. "How close?" 12 minutes from the front entrance. I've been moving since 9 this morning. I didn't know if I'd make it in time." The voice was George Sterling's, and underneath its control, there was something that had been held tightly for a very long time and was beginning, very carefully, to loosen. "Is she all right?" Ethan looked at Amelia. She was watching him with an expression that had moved past professional composure into something more unguarded. She'd heard enough of his side of the conversation to understand who was on the other end, and her face had done something complicated and honest in response to that understanding. "She's more than all right," Ethan said. "She's been running this since 9 this morning, and she hasn't stopped once." A quiet on the line that had weight to it. "I'll come in through the parking structure entrance. Jackson will need to meet me. Blake's people are watching the lobby." Ethan lowered the phone and looked at Jackson, who had stepped inside the doorway at some point in the last 30 seconds. "You heard?" Jackson's face had gone through several things rapidly and arrived at something that was equal parts relief and the particular expression of a man who understands that he is being given a chance he doesn't entirely deserve. "Parking structure entrance," he said. "I know it. Go." Jackson went. His footsteps were quick and purposeful down the corridor and then gone. Ethan turned back to Amelia. She was still standing with the same controlled stillness, but something behind her eyes was doing a kind of work that had nothing to do with corporate governance or evidentiary chains. 12 minutes, he said. She nodded once. Then she turned and opened Grace's door again. "How much do you need?" Grace looked up. She'd heard. Her expression confirmed it. "I have enough," she said. "Let's go." Buck. The executive floor had a particular geography that Ethan had mapped from the building schematics he'd reviewed 3 weeks ago, when George Sterling had given him everything he needed to study in preparation for this morning. The boardroom was at the north end of the floor, a large glass-walled space that could be partially obscured by automated privacy panels, which were currently deployed, turning the interior to a frosted opacity visible from the corridor. The elevator bank was at the south end. Between them, 60 feet of carpeted corridor, 2 assistant stations, a secondary meeting room, and a fire exit stairwell on the east wall. Blake and his 2 contract people were at the midpoint. Ethan saw them the moment the elevator doors opened. Blake was mid-40s, a large man who carried his size with the practiced casualness of someone who had learned that physical presence did most of the work without effort. The 2 men with him were younger, suited, the particular blank professional attention of contract security who were doing a job rather than invested in it. Blake clocked Ethan immediately. Then Grace,
then Amelia, and his expression shifted into something that was professionally neutral in the way that conceals an instruction received and a purpose in motion. "Ms. Sterling," Blake said. He addressed Amelia, but his eyes stayed on Ethan. "The board session has been moved to 125. Mr. Walker has asked that the executive floor be limited to board members and authorized personnel for the duration." He paused fractionally. "Mr. Carter doesn't have authorization for this floor." "Mr. Carter is here at my request," Amelia said. Her voice was exactly calibrated, not combative, not accommodating, the voice of someone who holds authority and is neither performing it nor apologizing for it. As is Ms. Parker, who is Sterling Dominion's general counsel. Both have full authorization under my executive access. Mr. Walker called an emergency board session," Amelia said. "He didn't inherit executive authority over personnel access by doing so. That authority is mine. Step aside, Connor." Blake didn't move. The two contract personnel shifted slightly, not aggressively, but positioning. Ethan registered it without changing his posture. "I have instructions," Blake said. "I understand that. And whoever gave you those instructions has a significant problem coming that you don't want to be standing in front of when it arrives." Amelia held his gaze. "I'm giving you the opportunity to make a different choice right now. Step aside." Something moved across Blake's face, a quick, involuntary calculation. He looked at Ethan, then at Grace with her document packet, then back at Amelia. Whatever he'd been instructed to expect, this particular configuration of calm and purpose wasn't entirely it. He didn't step aside, but he also didn't escalate. He took out his phone. Ethan spoke quietly, not to Blake, but sidelong, to no one in particular. "He's calling Ryan. Ryan will tell him to hold the position." He paused. "We have about 9 minutes before Jackson gets back. We don't need to be past Blake. We need to be in that boardroom before the session formally opens." Amelia looked at him. "The boardroom has a second entrance," he said. "East side, through the secondary meeting room. It was designed as an overflow access for large sessions." She knew that. He could see it in her face. She'd known it and had been moving toward the decision to use it. Sometimes people just needed to hear their own knowledge spoken by someone else to move. "Grace," she said. "Right behind you," Grace said. They turned. Blake said, "Ms. Sterling," and one of the contract men stepped forward, and Ethan simply placed himself between the man and Amelia with the quiet physical fact of someone who has made a decision and is done discussing it. He didn't touch anyone. He didn't threaten anything. He just stood there in the narrow corridor with the particular solidity of a man who has occupied worse positions under worse conditions and did not find this one especially remarkable. The contract man stopped. Amelia and Grace moved down the east corridor and through the secondary meeting room door, and Ethan gave it 4 seconds before he turned and followed them, walking backward for the first 2 steps to maintain the sight line, and then turning forward when the distance was sufficient. Behind him, he heard Blake on the phone saying something clipped and urgent, and then the sound of footsteps moving quickly in a different direction. He didn't run. Running was for people who weren't sure they were going to make it. The boardroom's secondary entrance was a plain door in the east wall, no glass panel, and it opened onto the side of the room rather than the head of the table. This meant that when Amelia walked in, she came in from the periphery rather than the front, which was not how she would have chosen it. But the room was arranged in a standard boardroom configuration, the long table running north to south, and she entered from the east side and walked directly to the head of the table before anyone had time to manage the moment. Ryan Walker was already standing at the front of the room when they entered. He had a presentation deployed on the large screen behind him, clean, corporate, the look of something that had been prepared carefully over time rather than assembled quickly. 12 board members occupied the seats along the table, most of them mid-60s or older, the particular demographic of people who had built careers in the era when Sterling Dominion was growing and who carried that history in the way they sat and the way they watched. Ryan's face when he saw Amelia was a study in a specific kind of controlled person facing a moment they prepared for but hoped wouldn't come. It was almost not visible, a fraction of a second rearrangement that only showed because Ethan was watching for it. Then it was gone, replaced by the expression Ryan Walker had likely been practicing for years. the expression of a man who was regrettably doing what was necessary. "Amelia," he said, "I'm glad you're here, actually. This concerns you directly, and it's better addressed with you present." "I'm sure it is," she said. She put the document packet Grace handed her onto the table in front of the nearest empty chair and remained standing. "Before you continue your presentation, Ryan, I need to introduce some materials to the board." "The session was formally opened 4 minutes ago," Ryan said. "We're in the middle of a motion. You can address the board after the current item is—" "The current item involves me," Amelia said. "I have a right to speak before any vote is taken on any motion that affects my position." "That's not a courtesy, Ryan. That's Article 7 of the company's governance charter. I assume Ms. Parker can cite the specific clause if necessary." Grace, standing at Amelia's right, said, "Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph 2, the right of response before a vote on executive status changes." Ryan looked at Grace, then at Ethan, who was standing near the east wall. Not at the table, not demanding space, simply present. The look Ryan gave Ethan was brief and had several things in it, and Ethan returned it with nothing in particular, which was somehow the more effective response. Ryan looked at the board. 12 faces looked back at him. Whatever signal he was hoping to read there, he didn't find it, or found it ambiguous enough that pressing the point would cost more than it gained. "Of course," he said. "Please." He gestured toward the front of the room with the grace of a man conceding a small thing while controlling a larger one. Amelia moved to the head of the table. She didn't look at the presentation behind her. She looked at the board. "I'm going to tell you something that I think is important to say before I show you any documentation," she said. "This morning I was presented with evidence about events inside this company that I didn't see clearly enough, soon enough. Some of that is because the evidence was deliberately concealed. Some of it is because I trusted certain people more than the facts warranted, and I didn't push hard enough when I should have." She paused. "I'm not telling you this to make a speech. I'm telling you because the next 20 minutes is going to involve a great deal of documented material, and you deserve to hear it from someone who is being straight with you about what they got wrong as well as what they got right." The room was quiet. Ryan's expression was attentive and patient, the expression of a man waiting for an opening. Grace began distributing document packets around the table, physical copies, individual sets, board members receiving them, and beginning to read with the particular focused attention of people who understood what a formal evidence presentation meant. Amelia walked them through it methodically. The access logs, the asset reclassification pattern, the Veristone Capital documentation, the registration trail that led back to Ryan Walker through 2 holding company layers, the video recording of George Sterling played through a laptop Grace had brought, filling the boardroom with a voice that most of the people in the room knew well and had not heard in over a year. And finally, the White Room logs, independent, native to Sentinel's own architecture, untouched by any external compilation, showing the same pattern from a completely separate source. She didn't editorialize. She laid it out and let it exist. Ryan interrupted twice. The first time he challenged the provenance of the video recording, how it was obtained, what verified its authenticity. Grace addressed it cleanly, citing the file metadata and the corroborating documentation that bracketed it. The second time, Ryan questioned the chain of custody on the White Room logs, noting that the room had been accessed by Amelia's own party that morning. "The White Room logs are time-stamped to their native server," Ethan said from the east wall. Several board members looked at him. He had not spoken yet, and the voice from the side of the room was unexpected. "The access records we retrieved this morning show the log files as they existed on the server at the time of access. They cannot be retroactively modified by the act of retrieval. The server's own architecture prevents it. The timestamp metadata is internally generated." He paused. "If the board wants an independent verification of that technical point, I can provide the name of 3 forensic computing firms that can confirm it within 48 hours. But the logs themselves are self-evidencing. The pattern they document spans 14 months and predates this morning by over a year." Ryan looked at him. The patience in his expression had developed a texture underneath it, something harder and less managed. "And who exactly are you?" he said. "For the benefit of the board." "My name is Ethan Carter. I'm a private security consultant engaged by George Sterling to facilitate the delivery of documentation to his daughter." He didn't expand, he didn't elaborate. He let the simplicity of it sit. "You have no standing in this room," Ryan said. "No," Ethan agreed. "I don't. The evidence does." One of the board members, a woman in her late 60s named Patricia Howe, who had been with the company since its second year and who had the careful, experienced eyes of someone who had survived many iterations of corporate politics, looked up from her document packet and said, "Ryan, the Veristone registration. I'd like you to speak to this specifically." Ryan looked at her. "Patricia, the documentation this morning was—" "I'd like you to speak to it," she said again, "directly. Is Veristone Capital a company you have a financial interest in?" Ryan's jaw tightened fractionally. The documentation being presented was compiled by parties with a clear interest in— "That's not an answer to what I asked." The room was very quiet. The particular quiet of people collectively arriving at an understanding they've been moving toward for several minutes and have finally reached. Ryan said, "I'd like to request that this session be paused pending independent legal review of the materials presented." Another board member, a man named Charles Whitfield, who had the look of someone who had been in enough corporate crisis situations to recognize the shape of one, said, "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that the materials were delivered by parties whose interests are—" The boardroom's main door opened. Not the secondary entrance. The primary doors, the ones Blake had been positioned to control. They opened, both of them, and Jackson Reed walked in, and beside him, moving with the slightly careful gait of a man who had been on his feet for a long time but was not going to show it in this room, was George Sterling. He was 64 years old, and he looked every year of it in the way that men who have built things from nothing look their age. Not as deterioration, but as accumulation. He wore a gray suit that wasn't his best and hadn't been pressed recently, and his hair was longer than in his photographs, and there was a weariness in his face that no amount of composure fully covered. But he walked to the head of the table and he stood there, and the room did something that rooms rarely do, which is go completely and immediately still. Ryan Walker's expression, for the first time that morning, lost its management entirely. It was only a second, 1 second, where the calculation behind his face shut down and something rawer showed. Not quite fear, but the adjacent thing, the thing that lives next to fear in a person who has built an elaborate structure and is watching the foundation shift. Then it closed again. But everyone in the room had seen it, and everyone in the room knew what it meant. George Sterling looked around the table slowly. He looked at Ryan last, and the look he gave him was not angry. It was something harder to receive than anger. The look of a person who trusted you, remembers trusting you, and is standing in the room where you tried to use that trust against the people he loved. "I apologize for my absence," he said. His voice was steady. "I owe the board an explanation for that, and I'll provide one. But first," he looked at Ryan. "Ryan, it's over. Whatever you're about to say, or argue, or request, it's over. The evidence in front of this board is accurate. I compiled the majority of it myself. And I'm standing here because I am not willing to watch the company I spent 31 years building be dismantled by someone I made the mistake of trusting." Ryan said nothing. His hands were flat on the table and very still. George looked at the board. "I'd like to move that the current session be formally redirected to address the materials presented by my daughter. Amelia Sterling remains CEO of this company. That position is not in question. What is in question is the conduct of individuals inside Sterling Dominion who have operated against its interests and against the people in it." He paused. "I'll second my own motion if Patricia's willing to chair." Patricia Howe said, without hesitating, "So moved." The motion carried. 8 votes to 2, with 2 abstentions. The math of a room that has seen what it has seen and reached its own conclusion. Ryan stood and said something about his legal counsel, and the words had the quality of words spoken because silence would be worse, without any real force behind them. Grace Parker told him with the measured, precise calm of a woman who had been practicing this moment in some form for the past 2 hours that he was welcome to contact his legal counsel and that he should be aware that a formal referral to the appropriate authorities would be initiated within the hour based on the materials presented. Blake arrived at the boardroom door 30 seconds later, the 2 contract men behind him, and found Jackson Reed already stationed inside the entrance. Blake looked at the room. at George Sterling at the head of the table, at Amelia beside him, at the board members with their document packets, and whatever instruction he'd been holding on to released, visibly, like air going out of something. He stepped back from the door. One of the contract men left without being asked. Ethan stayed near the east wall through all of it. He watched George Sterling greet his daughter. Not a dramatic reunion, nothing that looked the way it might in a story someone had constructed for effect. It was quieter than that. George put one hand on Amelia's shoulder, and she put her hand over his, briefly, and they said something to each other too low for the room to hear. Whatever it was enough. They stood like that for about 4 seconds, and then they both turned back to the table and the work still in front of them. That was its own kind of story, Ethan thought. The most important things between people almost never looked the way they were supposed to look. He was watching Ryan Walker when it happened. Ryan had been standing in the far corner of the room, slightly apart from the table, while Grace spoke with 2 board members about procedural next steps. He'd been quiet. Too quiet. The quality of quiet that belongs to a man who has not yet given up, but is running out of visible options. Ryan's hand moved toward the laptop on the table. Grace's laptop, the one that held the evidence package and the recovered files from the broken device. Ethan moved. He wasn't fast in the way that looks fast. No lunge, no dramatic reach. He simply closed the distance between himself and the table at a pace that arrived exactly when it needed to, and his hand came down on the laptop lid before Ryan's fingers reached the keyboard. Ryan looked at him. They were very close. A foot, maybe less. The evidence is already copied to 3 separate drives and documented in the chain of custody packet, Ethan said quietly. Deleting this copy accomplishes nothing except adding evidence tampering to what's already documented. Ryan stared at him, the construction behind his eyes, all the strategy and patience and calculated positioning that had built 14 months of careful work, was dismantling itself in real time in a way that, even here, even knowing what the man had done, was not entirely comfortable to watch. People did not collapse cleanly. "You don't know what this company could have been," Ryan said. His voice was low, controlled, but with a quality of authenticity underneath it that Ethan hadn't heard from him before. What Sentinel could have been in the right hands. Not hers, not George's. The potential that's been sitting in this building unused because neither of them had the... "You don't get to decide that," Ethan said. "That's the part you got wrong. You built a plan around the conclusion that your judgment about what this company should be was worth more than everyone else's right to determine it for themselves." He paused. "It doesn't matter how right you might have been about the potential. You don't get to take what isn't yours." Ryan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked away, which was its own kind of answer. Ethan stepped back and picked up the laptop and handed it to Grace without comment. Across the room, Jackson Reed was standing near the door with the posture of a man who had come back to himself after a long absence. Not all the way back, maybe, but far enough. He caught Ethan's eye and gave a single nod, the kind that doesn't need translation. Outside the boardroom's north-facing windows, the city moved through its afternoon the way cities do. Indifferent, continuous, enormous in its ordinary scale. Somewhere inside it, Maya Carter was at school learning something, or failing to pay attention, or making her teacher laugh, entirely unaware that her father had spent the day doing what he had spent most of his adult life doing, standing between the thing that wanted to break something and the thing that needed to stay whole. He'd pick her up at 3:15. He was going to be on time. Part 5. The Man Behind the Armor. The arrests happened quietly, the way things that have been a long time coming often do. Ryan Walker left the boardroom at 2:47 in the afternoon, flanked by 2 federal agents who had been waiting in the building's lobby since 1 o'clock. Grace Parker had made a call that morning that Ethan hadn't known about, a call to a financial crimes contact she'd cultivated over 15 years of corporate law practice, the kind of contact that exists in the space between official channels and the human reality that institutions are run by individuals who sometimes answer their phones when the situation warrants it. The agents were unhurried, professional, and entirely unmoved by Ryan's attorney's name, which he produced within 90 seconds of understanding what was happening. Connor Blake was detained on the executive floor 30 minutes later. He didn't resist.
He sat down in the chair Jackson indicated and put his hands on the table and looked at the wall with the expression of a man who has been running a calculation for a long time and has finally arrived at the conclusion that the numbers were always going to come out this way. Jackson watched it happen and didn't feel the satisfaction he might have expected. What he felt was more complicated than satisfaction and less clean. The particular weight of a person who has spent years believing they understood the environment they were operating in and discovered in a single morning that they understood far less than they thought. Blake had been in his department for 2 years. Jackson had approved his access clearances, reviewed his performance reports, recommended him for a certification upgrade 8 months ago. None of those things felt like mistakes in isolation. Together, they felt like a map of his own blind spots. He filed the feeling away. He didn't try to resolve it on the spot, because some things don't resolve on the spot, and pretending they do is its own kind of failure. George Sterling spent the afternoon in a conference room on the 14th floor, the Meridian Room, where this day had effectively begun, working through the immediate stabilization priorities with Amelia and 2 members of the board's executive committee. He looked tired in a way that the adrenaline of the boardroom had temporarily masked, and that was now reasserting itself with the patient insistence of a debt coming due. He drank 3 cups of coffee in 2 hours and didn't finish any of them. At 4:15, Amelia sent everyone out of the room except her father. She closed the door, and they were alone for the first time since before he'd gone off grid 3 months ago. And for a moment they just looked at each other across the table the way people look at each other when they have a great deal to say and none of it has found its proper form yet. George said, "I should have told you more. Earlier. All of it." "Yes," Amelia said. "You should have. I was trying to protect you from uncertainty while I built something solid enough to—" "I know why you did it," she said. "I understand the reasoning. I even understand why you thought it was right." She paused. "It wasn't right." He looked at her. Then he nodded, which cost him something. She could see it cost him something, and that made it mean more. "You ran it well today," he said. "Without me, before I got there. I had help." "The help you trusted with it," he said. "That's a judgment call. You made it right." Amelia looked at the table for a moment. At the index card that was no longer in her pocket because she'd set it on the table in front of her at some point in the afternoon without noticing she'd done it. Her father's handwriting, cramped and familiar. She pushed it across the table toward him. He looked at it. He'd written it. He knew what it said. But he read it again anyway, and something moved across his face that belonged to the father rather than the founder, and he didn't try to cover it. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I kept it." Malpultit. Ethan left the building at 3:02. He made it to Maya's school with 4 minutes to spare, which in the calculus of elementary school pickup, the particular chaos of children and parents, and a parking lot that seemed designed by someone who had never driven a car, amounted to arriving exactly on time. He stood at the edge of the pickup area in his worn navy coat, which had survived the day with one new scuff on the left sleeve from some moment in the corridors he couldn't specifically remember, and he watched the school doors until they opened and the afternoon flood of children began. Maya came out 8th or 9th in the stream. He didn't count, he just knew her in the way parents know their children at a distance, the particular shape and movement, and the way she wore her backpack on both shoulders because she'd decided 2 years ago that one shoulder was inefficient. She was 10 years old and had her mother's mouth and her father's eyes and an opinion about most things that she would share with or without invitation. She spotted him and changed course without breaking stride, the way kids navigate toward their people, and when she got close enough she said, "You're wearing the coat." "It's my coat." "It's your old coat. You have a better one." "The other one's at home." She fell into step beside him, and they walked toward the parking lot. "Did you have a work thing?" "Yeah." "In a building?" "Yeah." She considered that. Maya had a particular processing style. She absorbed information, ran it through whatever interior system she used for evaluation, and then returned a conclusion that was frequently more accurate than the information warranted. "Was it hard?" "It was a long day," he said, "but it went okay." She accepted that the way she accepted most of his brief work answers,
with the pragmatic patience of a child who understands that some things are complicated and that her father will tell her what she needs to know when she needs to know it. She trusted him in the fundamental way that children trust the people who show up reliably, not blindly. Maya was not a blind trust kind of person, but earned trust, the kind built from years of 315 pickups and keeping promises and being in the kitchen when she came downstairs in the morning. "I made a mistake in math today," she said. "A dumb one. I knew the answer and I rushed." "Did you fix it?" "Ms. Harmon let me go back through it. I got it right the second time." "That's the part that matters," he said. She looked up at him sideways, the look of a kid deciding whether an adult answer is genuine or generic. Apparently she decided it was genuine because she nodded and switched topics to something that had happened at lunch, involving a disagreement about the rules of a game that Ethan only partially followed but listened to completely. He drove home with the radio off and his daughter talking in the passenger seat, and the city moved past the windows in the early evening light, and the day folded itself into the past, the way days do. The formal investigation into Ryan Walker and Connor Blake was opened within 72 hours of the boardroom session by a federal financial crimes unit, acting on the referral Grace Parker had initiated and the evidence package her office had compiled and delivered through official channels before the end of the business day. The investigation would take 7 months to conclude, which is how long these things take when they are done properly. Not the compressed dramatic timeline of a story with a single climactic moment, but the long, grinding, careful work of building a prosecutable case from a complex web of documentation and testimony. Ryan Walker's legal team was expensive and skilled, as expected. They filed 3 motions in the first 30 days, challenged the chain of custody on the White Room logs, and attempted to argue that the Veristone capital structure represented a legitimate business arrangement rather than a fraudulent one. Each argument was addressed methodically by a federal prosecution team that had seen similar constructions before and knew where the seams were. In the end, the evidence was what it was. The access logs from Sentinel's native architecture didn't have an argument against them. They were the system's own record of what had happened inside it, time-stamped and verified by architecture rather than testimony. The Veristone trail, once properly forensically traced, was unambiguous, and George Sterling was available and willing to testify in detail about everything he had observed and documented over 14 months of investigation. Ryan Walker pleaded guilty to 4 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of attempted unauthorized transfer of proprietary technology 11 days before the scheduled trial date. He received 6 years. Connor Blake, who cooperated with investigators beginning in the 3rd month, received a reduced sentence of 18 months and formal disbarment from the security industry. Ethan learned the outcome from a news brief on his phone while sitting in a parking lot outside a grocery store, waiting for a rainstorm to ease enough to make the dash inside worth attempting. He read the article once, put his phone back in his pocket, and sat for a moment in the sound of rain on the roof of his car. 6 years. A number. The formal accounting of something that had tried to do significant damage and been stopped before most of it landed. He didn't feel triumphant about it, which was normal. He rarely felt triumphant about outcomes in the security and intelligence spaces he'd spent his adult life inhabiting. What he felt was closer to the particular quiet satisfaction of a door being properly closed, the latching of something that had been left open and shouldn't have been. The rain eased. He got out and went to do the shopping. Sterling Dominion's internal restructuring took longer than the legal proceedings, which was also normal, because institutions are harder to fix than specific events. Amelia spent the 6 months following the boardroom session doing the work that never shows up in company press releases. The unglamorous, incremental, frequently frustrating process of examining every system, every access protocol, every oversight structure in the company, and asking the question that should have been asked years earlier. What would have to be true for this to be exploited, and how do we make it harder? She brought in outside security consultants for the technical infrastructure review, which was standard. What was less standard was that she also brought in an organizational psychologist to study the company's internal culture. Specifically, the dynamics that had allowed a senior executive to build a 14-month conspiracy without any of the people around him raising a concern that reached her desk. That review was uncomfortable in the way that honest organizational reviews are always uncomfortable. It named things. It described patterns that people recognized in retrospect and felt varying degrees of complicity about. She required every member of the senior leadership team to read it, including herself. The new internal oversight board, independent directors with rotating chairs, empowered to initiate investigations without executive approval, was her design. Built from the ground up with Grace Parker and with input from 3 board members who had been in that room when her father walked through the door and who had left with a renewed understanding of what the absence of independent oversight could cost. She gave a formal address to the company at the end of the restructuring period. Not a press release, not a prepared statement delivered through a communications team. She stood in the main atrium of the building, the same lobby where a man in a worn coat had stood against a column 6 months earlier, and she spoke to the assembled employees without notes. She told them that she had failed to see something that was happening inside their company. She told them why she thought she'd missed it, the specific combination of trust and busyness and the institutional tendency to interpret the absence of a visible problem as the presence of everything being fine. She told them that she was implementing changes because of what she'd gotten wrong, not in spite of it. She told them that anyone in the building who identified something that didn't look right had a named person to contact, a process to follow, and a guarantee that contacting that person would not cost them their position. She didn't promise perfection. She'd watched what the promise of perfection looked like from the inside when she was the one who'd been trusted with it. What she promised instead was transparency about failure, which is a harder and less comfortable thing to promise and a more useful one to receive. The atrium was quiet when she finished. Then someone started clapping, slowly. She couldn't tell who. It came from somewhere in the middle of the assembled group, and it spread in the uncoordinated, genuine way that applause spreads when it isn't prompted, which is the only kind that means anything. She stood there and let it happen and tried to receive it honestly, which was harder than it sounded. George Sterling did not return to Sterling Dominion in any official capacity. This surprised people who expected it, which turned out to be most people, including several board members who had assumed that the return to the boardroom was the prelude to a return to power. It wasn't. George made that clear in a letter to the board delivered 10 days after the boardroom session, a letter that was brief and direct in the way that letters from people who have had time to think tend to be. He wrote that he had built the company he'd intended to build, that Amelia was running it the way it needed to be run, that his role in the recent events had been the role of a man trying to protect something he cared about, not the role of someone who needed to lead it, and that confusing those two things was one of the mistakes that had made him easier to isolate in the first place. He wrote that he was going to take some time to figure out what came after 31 years of building something, and that he suspected it would be quieter than what came before, and that he thought he was ready for that. He spent the following months traveling, not the purposeful, destination-oriented travel of someone with an agenda, but the slower kind, the kind that involves staying in places long enough to understand them a little. He called Amelia every Sunday. Sometimes the calls were 20 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. He was figuring out how to talk to her the way a father talks to an adult daughter he respects, which is different from how a founder talks to a successor, and the figuring out was visible in the calls in a way that was imperfect and recognizable and more valuable than a polished version would have been. Well, Jackson Reed kept his job. This was not, as he understood it, the obvious outcome. He had made a significant error of judgment in the opening minutes of a crisis, an error that had set in motion a cascade of consequences he had then spent the rest of the day trying to help correct. The correction didn't erase the error. He knew that, and he didn't try to argue otherwise. What he did instead, in the weeks following the boardroom session, was write a report. A thorough one, self-authored, detailing everything he had done, the reasoning behind each decision, the points at which he could have chosen differently and didn't, and what he believed those points indicated about the weaknesses in his own decision-making under conditions of limited information and high social pressure. He submitted it to Amelia's office without being asked to. She read it, and then she requested a meeting, and in that meeting she asked him what he thought the report said about whether he should remain in his position. He said he thought it said that he was someone who had made a serious mistake under conditions that had been partially engineered to produce that mistake, and that he had then attempted to address the mistake with full transparency rather than self-protection.
He said he thought that pattern, the transparency, the self-examination, was more relevant to his fitness for the role than the mistake itself, but that he understood if she reached a different conclusion and would accept it. She told him she wanted him to rebuild the security division from a structural level, implementing the new oversight protocols with the specific authority to make personnel decisions without executive pre-approval, a safeguard against the exact dynamic that had allowed Blake's position to go unexamined. He said he'd start on Monday. She said she'd hold him to that. He started on Monday. It was 7 months after the events in the lobby when Ethan Carter returned to Sterling Dominion. He had not been back in the intervening time. There had been phone calls from Grace twice regarding testimony for the investigation, and once from George Sterling, who called to say something that turned out to be harder for him to say than he'd expected, which Ethan gave him the time to say without rushing it. But he hadn't been in the building. There had been no reason to be. He came now because Amelia had asked him to. She'd called him on a Thursday evening and asked if he could come in the following week, and she'd been slightly formal about it in the way of someone who has something to offer and isn't entirely sure how it will be received. He came on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays and Thursdays were Maya's pickup days, and he liked the symmetry of beginning and ending a workday around something that mattered in a different scale than work. He wore a different coat, the better one Maya had been lobbying for since November, which he'd finally replaced the navy wool with after the right sleeve developed an issue with the lining that he couldn't fix with the materials he had at home. The lobby of Sterling Dominion looked different in small, incremental ways that added up to something more significant than any individual change. The reception desk had been moved slightly, opening the sightlines through the main atrium. The security station was staffed by 2 people instead of 1, with a clearly posted access procedure on a panel beside them. Not bureaucratic, just visible. The difference between a process that exists and a process that can be found. The marble floor was the same. 40-foot ceilings were the same. The smell of filtered air and money was the same. Jackson Reed was standing near the elevator bank, which Ethan hadn't expected. He was in a suit that fit him better than the one from 7 months ago. Or maybe that was the same suit, and Ethan was misremembering. He looked like a man who had been doing difficult work and was still in the middle of doing it, and had made a certain peace with that ongoing condition. He held out a device. Not the forensic kind, not a company phone, a personal secured handset, consumer grade but encrypted, the kind a person could actually use for ordinary life and happen to also use for sensitive communication. "From me," Jackson said. "Not the company, me." Ethan took it, turned it over once in his hands, the way he'd turned the broken fragment over 7 months ago on a lobby counter while a building went into lockdown around him. This one was whole, screen uncracked, casing intact. "You didn't have to," Ethan said. "I wanted to." Jackson paused. "I've been thinking for 7 months about what to say if I saw you again. I had a whole thing prepared. It was pretty good, actually." He stopped. "But now that I'm standing here, what I've got is, I judged you in about 45 seconds based on what you looked like and what I assumed that meant, and I broke something that mattered because I was so sure I understood the situation that I didn't stop long enough to actually look at it." He met Ethan's eyes directly. "I'm sorry for what that's actually worth." Ethan held the device for a moment. "It's worth something," he said. "You did the harder thing after. That also counts." It was not absolution. Ethan wasn't in the business of handing that out, and Jackson wasn't in the business of asking for it. It was something more workable than absolution. An honest accounting between 2 people who had been on opposite sides of a bad moment and had both, in their different ways, chosen to move toward rather than away from what it revealed. Jackson gave a small nod and stepped back, and Ethan moved toward the elevator. Amelia's office was on the 22nd floor, and she was standing at the window when her assistant showed Ethan in, standing in the particular way that people stand at high windows when they're thinking through something that needs space around it. She turned when she heard the door. She looked like someone who had been doing hard work for 7 months and had not tried to make that invisible. There were lines of tiredness around her eyes that hadn't been there in October, or had been, and were now more settled in. She'd cut her hair shorter. She still wore the ring on her right hand. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You asked," he said. "So?" She almost smiled. The
The same almost smile from the hardware lab, the one that didn't quite complete itself but was recognizable. "Sit down," she said. "I have something to ask you, and I want to do it properly." He sat. She sat across from him and was direct about it, which was the only way she did things. "I want to offer you a position, Director of Security Architecture. It's a new role, built into the restructuring. The mandate is broad, independent oversight of all security systems and protocols, with specific authority to recommend structural changes at the system level without requiring executive pre-approval." She paused. "I'm not offering you Jackson's role. Jackson has that role. I'm offering you something that doesn't exist yet, which means it would be partly yours to define." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Why me?" "Specifically, because you understood what Sentinel was actually capable of before most people in this building did. Because you operate without needing the situation to look a certain way. Because you spent an entire day in a crisis inside a company where you had no standing and no backup, and you didn't panic, and you didn't make it about yourself." She looked at him directly. "And because my father trusts your judgment, and I've had 7 months to evaluate my father's judgment, and while his methods are sometimes his own, his read on people is generally very good." "It's a significant role," Ethan said. "It's designed to be." He turned the new phone over in his hands once, set it on the desk between them. "I have a 10-year-old daughter. My schedule is built around her. I pick her up at 3:15 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I'm not going to stop doing that regardless of what any job requires." "That's not a problem," Amelia said. "I'm not building a culture that eats people alive and calling it commitment. We had a version of that before, and I watched what it produced." She paused. 3:15 on Tuesdays and Thursdays is noted." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the window, at the city outside it, at the particular geometry of a view from high up in a building, the way distance flattens things and makes them legible in a different way than ground level does. He thought about Maya asking him, that evening in October, if the work thing had been hard, about the way she'd accepted his non-answer with the trust of a person who knew she was held securely enough that she didn't need all the information to feel safe. He thought about what it meant to do work that was worth something in the world, and how rarely that aligned with work that was also sustainable, and how both things had to be true for any of it to be worth the cost it extracted. "I have a condition," he said. "Tell me." "Sentinel's capabilities. The full architecture, the predictive intrusion modeling your father described. If this role involves oversight of how that technology is used and deployed, I need explicit authority to flag and halt any application that I determine crosses from defensive use into something else. Not recommend. Not escalate for review. Halt." He looked at her. "The technology is too significant to have that decision be diluted through a committee process. Whoever oversees it needs actual authority to stop it." Amelia was quiet for a moment. This was the part where a different kind of executive would hedge, would talk about process and consensus and board-level oversight. He could see her registering what he'd asked for, registering the implications of it, and deciding. "Agreed," she said. "We'll put it in the role definition." "In writing." "In writing," she confirmed. He picked up the phone from the desk, held it for a moment. "Okay," he said. Amelia nodded. She didn't make it larger than it was, which he appreciated. "Monday work?" "Monday works. I'll need to arrange pickup coverage for Tuesday." He paused. "Maya's going to want to know I'm working in a real office." "Will that impress her?" "It'll mean she can tell her friends something specific when they ask what her dad does. She's 10. That matters." This time Amelia did smile, not the almost version. The real one. It changed her face in the way genuine smiles change faces, briefly and completely. And it was gone in a moment, but it had been there. He took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, the marble floor caught the afternoon light the way marble does, cold and luminous, reflecting a version of the world that was slightly cleaner than the world itself. Ethan crossed it from the elevator bank to the main entrance, the same path he'd walked 7 months ago with the sealed envelope and the phone that got destroyed on the first morning and set everything else in motion. He thought about Ryan Walker, about the version of Ryan Walker that had existed before he'd become what he became, presumably an ordinary person who had been good at his job, who had spent years inside a company learning how it worked, who at some point had made a specific choice about what to do with that knowledge. The choice that seemed, from the inside, like the logical conclusion of everything he understood about power and opportunity and who deserved what. The choice that had been entirely wrong in the way that certain choices are wrong, not wrong because they fail, but wrong in their premise, in the fundamental misunderstanding of what ownership and trust in building something together actually required. He thought about the distance between a person's intelligence and their judgment. They were not the same thing. He'd known that for a long time, had watched men with brilliant tactical minds make catastrophic judgment calls in the field, and watched men with limited formal education make the right call in the dark, under pressure, with incomplete information. Intelligence told you how to execute. Judgment told you what was worth executing and why. Ryan had been intelligent. His judgment had been calibrated entirely toward a self that had stopped asking whether what it wanted was worth wanting. There was a lesson in that. Not a comfortable one, not the kind that resolves into a neat principle you could write on a card and hand to someone. Just the fact of it, the observation that the distance between capable and decent was not guaranteed by either talent or time, and had to be actively maintained by a person who kept asking themselves the questions that were easy to stop asking once the answers became inconvenient. He was not immune to that drift. He knew that about himself. He had made his share of choices under pressure that he examined differently afterward, alone, in the particular quiet of late nights when Maya was asleep and the house was still and there was nothing to do but sit with what he'd done and what he'd been. He didn't carry those moments like weight exactly. He carried them like calibration, the ongoing adjustment of a person trying to stay aimed at something worth being. He pushed through the revolving door. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the late afternoon of a day in late spring. The light at that particular angle that made even ordinary buildings look briefly significant. The particular sound of traffic and voices, and the systems of a large place running simultaneously. He stood on the steps for a moment and let it exist around him without trying to do anything with it. His phone buzzed. The new one. He looked at the screen. Maya, are you coming at 3:15, or is it a dad is late day? He looked at the time. 2:41. He typed back, 3:15. On my way. Her response came in 4 seconds. Okay, good, I have things to tell you. He put the phone in his pocket and started walking toward the parking structure. She always had things to tell him. That had been true since she was old enough to form sentences, and he expected it would be true for the rest of the time he had with her before the years did what years do and changed the texture of what she brought home from the world. He was aware, in the way that parents become aware when the early years are behind them, that the window for being the primary person his daughter turned to with the things she wanted to share was not permanent, that it was a specific and finite period and he was in the middle of it, that the right response to being in the middle of something valuable was to be in it, not to think about it ending, not to perform gratitude at it, just to actually be there when 3:15 came around and she came through the school doors with her backpack on both shoulders and something on her mind. He had been asked that morning what made him the right person for George Sterling to have called. Part of the answer was the skills, the background, the particular competencies accumulated over 12 years of training and field work and the quieter years after. Those were real, and they had mattered today, and they would matter in the work ahead. But the other part was simpler and harder to explain to people who hadn't lived it. The part that came from being the only person responsible for another person's mornings. From having the kind of life where showing up was not optional, because if you didn't show up, nobody did. From understanding, at a ground level that couldn't be theorized or performed, what it meant to protect something that depended on you, not because you were impressive, but because you were there. That was what George Sterling had heard in his voice 11 years ago, and remembered enough to call, not the resume. The understanding of what it meant to be accountable to something beyond yourself, and to carry that accountability not as a burden, but as the organizing principle of a life. Some people found that organizing principle in institutions, in causes, in the work itself. Ethan had found it in a 10-year-old girl who wanted to know if he was going to be on time. He was going to be on time. The parking structure was cool and dim after the afternoon light, and his footsteps echoed off the concrete in the way that parking structures do. And he walked to his car and got in and pulled out into the street and joined the long, ordinary flow of people moving through the city toward whatever came next. 7 months ago, a man in a worn coat had walked into a building with nothing but a sealed envelope and a phone that wasn't his. And the world he'd walked into had looked at him and decided, before he'd spoken, before he'd done anything at all, that it already knew what he was. It had been wrong. The world was frequently wrong about the people it decided it already understood. It had been wrong about Amelia, who the industry had assumed was her father's ornament and found out was her own structure. It had been wrong about Jackson, who the crisis had assumed was an obstacle and who turned out to be a man capable of the hardest and most unglamorous kind of change. It had been wrong about George Sterling, who everyone thought had withdrawn from the story and who had simply moved to a position where he could still protect what he'd spent his life building. And it had been wrong about Ethan in the way it was wrong about a specific kind of person, the person who does not announce themselves, who does not require the external architecture of authority or title or appearance to know what they're doing and why. The person who has already decided what they're for before anyone asks, and who does not need to be impressive to be effective, and who finds the deepest part of their capacity not in the exceptional moments, but in the ordinary ones. In 3:15, in both hands on the backpack straps, in a kitchen light left on. The city moved past the windows. He turned on the radio, found something he didn't hate, and drove.